Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for having me here. If you had told me 5 years ago that I'd still be talking about the 1619 project right after it came out, I would have been somewhat surprised. I didn't think that this was going to be much more than a one news cycle type of a story, an event that just popped up in the New York Times in August 2019. And I remember that morning because I was actually excited when I opened up the newspaper as I'm eating my breakfast and saw that they were doing a special issue on the history of slavery. Why was I excited? Because I work on the history of slavery, and when the paper of record starts to pay attention to an academic project, academics' work, we suddenly feel like someone's actually reading the stuff that we write. That's not all that common. Then I started digging through the 1619 project, and by the time I got to the second essay, I wanted to throw my laptop against the wall, which is, I think, unfortunately, where that the trajectory of that project ended up going has moved away from what could have been a very promising academically oriented but popular engagement about a very important issue, the history of slavery and the legacy of slavery in the United States, and they turned it into a political project. I want to start, though, with the show of hands. How many of you read the original 1619 project that came out in the New York Times? Keep your hands up. Now, how many of you read the much longer book-length edition that came out about 2 years later? Who saw the Hulu series that came out 1 year ago? Yeah. So we've seen that this has morphed into multiple different subsequent projects and products, and all of them are being very aggressively targeted and pushed into the public K-12 education system. By intentional design, it was launched with a curriculum back in 2019, and the curriculum's only grown. There has been a political movement to make this adopted as the new standard way of looking at U.S. history. And let's see if we can get that started. There we are. So that's the original 1619 project. When I first read it, I thought that, I probably would be asked to respond, and sure enough, National Review called me like a day or so after the first edition came out and said, we need some content on this. This is turning into a big political controversy. Can you write a response essay? And I think 48 hours later, I was one of the first people out the gate with a response essay critiquing the economics of the 1619 project, which had some very problematic claims. After that, it blew up into a giant political dispute. And oddly enough, here I'm coming at the 1619 project from a free market perspective, from a classical grounding in American history. It's the only time probably in my career that I have to date, probably ever will, find myself on the same side of an argument as the World Socialist website. Why? Because there are actually some decent historians on the left and the far left that were recruited by the World Socialist website to make some of the exact same critiques I was making. They were saying that this thing strayed from the facts. Its narrative strayed away from basic conventional facts about American history and evidence. And one thing that we had in common is we were all asking, how did this get through the fact checkers at the New York Times? The famous paper of record that rigorously fact checks everything, or so they claim. Well, it turns out we discovered a few months later, one of those fact checkers, Leslie Harris, who's a professor of history at Northwestern University and an expert in the American Revolution, revealed that she warned the New York Times against making some of its most controversial claims, and they ignored her. They did it anyway. Yet here we are, almost 5 years later, and this thing is still rolling, and it's morphed into a very aggressive political project. I want to look at the controversies of the 1619 project, and oddly enough, they really focus on almost entirely upon the first 2 chapters out of the 12 key essays that appear in the first edition. It's since been expanded in the book version, so they added some new essays to it, and they're not all that great. But the first 2 chapters are really where the core of the claim of the 1619 project comes together. And this is Nicole Hannah-Jones's opening essay on the American Revolution and the role of slavery supposedly in the American Revolution and founding. And then the second essay by Matthew Desmond, which purports to look at the economics of slavery, and in particular, slavery's relationship to what it calls capitalism. Although that used to be a very strange merging of terms in the way that Desmond presents it. And actually, both of these claims appear in the lead essay. I'll show you a segment from that in just a moment. But I want to look at the history behind both of these claims. First is that the colonists basically revolted against the British Crown over the issue of slavery. Who's heard that before? It's come up in the 1619 Project, and it's been put forth as part of their curriculum. One of their major claims is, they even stated this in the original version, they wanted to displace the year 1776 as the basis of the American founding and replace it with 1619 and have a very slavery-centric narrative of how the United States came into being, walked through its entire history with slavery as the focal point. Now, slavery is certainly a huge issue in American history, and it's a major ethical issue, something that I urge people to study in depth and with nuance and to explore original documents. 1619 Project did not do that. Instead, they advanced this claim, and they immediately came under fire for it. You see, I broke that into two sections. The very first one, the one that's underlined, Nicole Hannah-Jones asserts that the American colonists decided to declare their independence from Britain. It was because they wanted to protect the institution of slavery. Declaration of Independence supposedly wants to protect the institution of slavery. And then she links that to the second claim, which leads into the next essay by Matthew Desmond. Says there's an economic motive for this. And her assertion is that the British Empire was starting to question slavery and decided that it was a barbaric institution. So they were also seeing a growing call to abolish the slave trade, and she said this basically undermined the economy of the United States, or what became the United States, the colonies. And that dual threat of growing abolition from the British Empire, plus the threat to slavery itself, caused the colonists to rebel. And that's the gist of the narrative. You can see how it's a controversial claim. I don't read anything in the Declaration of Independence that says we're rebelling over slavery and the British Crown threatening slavery. If anything, Thomas Jefferson in his original draft, he had a clause that unfortunately was taken out condemning King George for imposing the slave trade on the colonies. So this is a very odd, contentious historical claim. Although Nicole Hannah-Jones had a very slim kernel of truth that she based this on. And as the essay evolved, as she came under fire for making these claims, she tried to backfill it with evidence. She tried to scour the historical record and find, are there examples that I can enlist that show that the colonists revolted over slavery? And that's the narrative that you see that's been carried forward all the way into the Hulu series. Right there, that's the poster from it. Does anyone know what this building is? Some of you have probably been there on vacation over the summer. That's Colonial Williamsburg. That's the Governor's Palace in Williamsburg. And it's going to play a key role in how the 1619 Project's narrative evolved, but it also shows one of the major problems. So remember that building. But Nicole Hannah-Jones, after she came under fire for this claim, she dug up a legal case out of Great Britain called the Somerset case in 1772. Somerset case was a really interesting legal precedent. It's important, probably more so for the United States than it was the British Empire. What happened is a slave owner from Virginia sailed across the Atlantic with his personal slave as a servant on board a ship, goes into the docks in London, and some local abolitionists in London realized that this man was holding a slave against his will on board a ship. And England had no law establishing slavery at the time. So what did the abolitionists do? They went down to the court and they filed a writ of habeas corpus, asked the judge to order this person that was being imprisoned against his will brought before the court. And the judge looks into the law and says, you know, you're right, there is no law establishing slavery here. It does exist in the colonies, but not here in England proper. Mr. Somerset, you're free to go. It's a very important case that was ruled on 1772, and it's one of the first major movements of the abolition. Although it's only a single person that's freed, that becomes important. Although this case precedent is also absorbed into American law. It's basically used in 1781 by the state of Massachusetts, now independent, to abolish slavery there. They realized they had no law in the books that allowed slavery. And several subsequent states attempted to use this precedent, all the way up to one that you probably do know about, the Dred Scott case, right on the eve of the Civil War, was a Somerset-style lawsuit. So they made the argument, I think quite correctly, that Dred Scott had been moved into a state of the United States that did not have slavery in the books, and therefore he should have been free to go. That was contested. And the Civil War comes directly out of that contestation. But Nicole Hannah-Jones finds that she saw, I've got my proof. Britain was about to abolish slavery in this court case. What she neglected to do is look at how the Americans responded to the Somerset case. And I'll give you the passage right there from this obscure little figure by the name of Benjamin Franklin. He decides to write one of his abolitionist friends after he gets word of the Somerset case. And the gist of his letter is, I agree with the ruling, but the British Empire is full of hypocrites because they consider themselves acting in the moral cause of ending slavery when they only freed one person. They should have freed them all. It's a complication we already see in Nicole Hannah-Jones' narrative. She was presented with this and started to back away from the Somerset case. You can see also it's a recurring theme. Benjamin Franklin refers to the guinea trade, the slave trade, as being imposed from Britain abroad. That's a recurring theme in the lead up to the Revolution. So this is one of the local resolves. This one was actually signed by George Washington in 1774, also protesting against the slave trade. Turns out, if we try to understand and map out slavery in the founding generation of the United States, it gets very, very complicated. A true nuanced history of this event would say and acknowledge that slavery cross-cuts the Revolution. There are pro-slavery and anti-slavery figures on both sides. Although the philosophical ideals on the American side end up being more conducive to abolition in the long run. Why? Because they establish individual rights, life, liberty, and property. This is part of our foundational documents. And it's very obvious to anyone that reads those words, reads the Declaration of Independence, and reads the arguments against the Crown, they come to a conclusion very quickly that slavery is not a consistent institution with these ideals. So how do we break up the founding generation? Well, there are abolitionists. Benjamin Franklin, I already mentioned, is one. James Otis, the No Taxation Without Representation guy, he actually writes a pamphlet denouncing slavery that's been done by the British Crown in the lead up to the Revolution. John Adams is an anti-slavery man. You start getting some weird complexity. There are slave owners in the southern states that immediately recognize what they are doing in breaking away from Britain is inconsistent with this institution that they practice. One that I like to mention, Luther Martin. He's a member of the Constitutional Convention in 1787. And he's most famous for, he stands up at the convention and says, I refuse to sign this document, the Constitution, because we've missed the opportunity to end slavery now. He came from a slaveholding household, but he was ready to be rid of the institution. He says, this is part of our philosophical ideal. We have a chance to end it now when we failed, so I'm not signing it. You also have slave owners that are born into the system, inherit massive plantations, and have religious conversion. They realize that what they are doing is wrong, immoral, sinful. One of them, Robert Counselor Carter, he's one of the largest slave owners in Virginia. He has a religious awakening, walks down to the courthouse, files a deed, and frees his entire plantation overnight. Didn't make him all that popular with his neighbors, but he made a moral act. And you have some people that are conflicted about it, that inherited the institution. These are the well-known Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, George Washington, but they do have moral qualms with it. And most of their political careers are about that struggle. How do they reconcile this practice that they are doing with the philosophical ideal that says this is wrong and this is something that should be condemned and abolished? And they really struggle with the challenge. They try to find genuine routes to wean the country away from slavery through their own presidencies, their own careers, and their own lifespans. And really, this is this last category that the 1619 Project would take and try to project onto the whole. That is the pro-slavery slave owners. Now, many of you know who William Lawton Smith is? Not the most well-known founding father. He's a very obscure congressman from South Carolina that gives a pro-slavery speech in the early republic. Nicole Hannah-Jones would take someone like William Lawton Smith and say that represents the entirety of the whole. And there's the problem that we have with this narrative. It gets worse. Nicole Hannah-Jones came under fire for this claim about the American Revolution and her own fact-checkers contradicting her. So she started to scrounge around in the historical record to see if she could find more evidence. She settled on this guy. You can see he's obviously a Scottish lord. That is Lord Dunmore. He is the last colonial governor of Virginia. And she settles on him around this claim because in November 1775, Lord Dunmore, as the revolution is already underway, remember Lexington and Concord is in April 1775, we had been at war for over a year before we declared independence. But Lord Dunmore, in November 1775, he issues a decree that says, any slave of a rebellious plantation owner who makes his way to my lines and joins my militia will be free. He has an exemption in there. He says, if you're a loyal plantation owner, your slaves don't count and you're not eligible. But rebellious plantation owners, if your slaves make their way to my lines, they will be free. And of course, he wants to use them as cannon fodder on the front lines. It's a really horrible time in warfare, but nonetheless, he makes this decree. Nicole Hannah-Jones sees Lord Dunmore, and she claims, aha, even if we can't say that the whole of the United States rebelled against the crown for slavery, it has to be true of the southern states, particularly Virginia. And she claims in there, for men like George Washington, Dunmore's proclamation is what brought them over to the cause of independence. There's a little problem with that. See the date? November 7th, 1775. Washington had already been in command of the Continental Army for several months. So we start to see a recurring theme that the 1619 Project plays fast and loose with facts and dates, unless it has a time machine. Why is Lord Dunmore also significant? He's the occupant of that building in colonial Williamsburg that I showed you the picture of, for a time. Nicole Hannah-Jones depicts in the Hulu series Dunmore standing on the front door of the governor's palace and basically decreeing to the slaves, you are emancipated if you come to my cause. It never happened. He did issue the decree, but he had been chased out of the colony almost 6 months earlier by the Patriot armies. He had been chased out through a strange sequence of events in Williamsburg, right down to the week of Lexington and Concord, although they didn't know the battles had started up north yet. The word had not made its way down the coast. But Lord Dunmore knew there were rumors of a revolt against the crown. And in April 1775, at midnight, he orders the British troops to go into the gunpowder stores in Williamsburg and seize all the gunpowder and move it on board a ship. The colonists wake up the next morning, they're furious. Where's our gunpowder? You left us defenseless. Lord Dunmore says, well, I heard rumors that the slaves were about to revolt, so I seized the gunpowder for your own protection. The colonists were furious. What did they do? They started calling in the militias that marched on Williamsburg. And in less than a month, Lord Dunmore had fled with his family on board the same warship, and he's sitting out in the James River. He only returns to land a couple of times between then and his decree, one of which is he goes to this plantation a few miles up the river and has his own very large staff of slaves serve him and his officers a meal. So it's very strange that this man has been turned into an emancipationist, almost abolitionist hero by the 1619 Project. Turns out he's actually a slave owner, and a pretty brutal, horrific one, if anything that we know of his historical record is to be studied. And yet, that's become the centerpiece of the claim. It gets more complex. We find that there are slave owners and slavery supporters on the British side of the American Revolution. That's Bannister Tarleton. How many of you seen the Mel Gibson movie about the Revolution from about 20, 25 years ago? The bad guy is based on this real historical figure. He was the cavalry commander for General Cornwallis. He is also the son of one of the largest slave trader merchants in Liverpool. He fought the Revolution probably because he wanted to get some land in the Carolinas that he could claim as his own afterward. Why? To establish and perpetuate and extend slavery. After he loses the Revolution, he goes back and takes a seat in Parliament and becomes the main advocate of the slaveholder interests in the British Parliament for another decade. So a really bad guy. Here's a good guy. British citizen, another member of Parliament. That's Charles James Fox. Two significant things about Charles James Fox. One you can see in the painting there. He's wearing a blue coat and a gold vest. Where did those colors come from? That's George Washington's uniform. A member of British Parliament intentionally dressing in George Washington's colors for his official portrait in the middle of the American Revolution. This is a not too nice gesture to King George. He supports the American side, but he's also significant for another reason. He's the first member of Parliament to seriously make an attack on the institution of slavery. And you can see from the timeline over the course of his career, from 1791 onward, he is the main sponsor of bills to abolish the slave trade and eventually slavery itself. He dies in 1807 after his first bill makes it through, and then his successors carry that all the way up to the abolition of slavery in the British Empire in 1834. So you have the leading member of the anti-slavery faction in the House of Commons is a supporter of the American Revolution. The leading figure of the pro-slavery faction, Bannister Tarleton, fights in the revolution against the colonists. We see how things have gotten very messy. And then you also have a succession of abolition events that flow directly from the American Revolution, especially in the northern states. Starting in Vermont in 1777, it's a no man's land, it breaks away. They're trying to figure out which side of the revolution they join, and they align with the Americans. But in their constitution, they banned slavery. And then successively, in state after state after state, all the way through 1799, all of the northern states eliminate slavery through various means. You see some of the reasons that they state there. This is the Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Court. He makes a ruling in 1781 to abolish slavery in Massachusetts. He says, why? Well, everyone's entitled to liberty. We're fighting this revolution on certain principles, and those principles are inconsistent with slavery. And there's, again, what I mentioned earlier, Luther Martin in the Constitutional Convention. He says, our ideals are inconsistent with this institution. We cannot allow them to exist. Unfortunately, he loses the votes on that opportunity. But nonetheless, it's there. It's a prominent part of the American story. So I think that brings us to a point where the 1619 Project is just an unreliable observer of slavery in the American Revolution. Now remember that passage, there were two quotes in there. The first makes the claim about the Revolution. Next she goes to the economics behind it. Nicole Hannah-Jones and her author that she recruited to write this, Matthew Desmond, continue from their point about the American Revolution to asserting that American capitalism itself is an institution wedded to and derived from slavery. And you see several versions of this claim. They're promoted very heavily by this group of historians that all consulted for the 1619 Project. They're mostly Ivy League historians, refer to themselves as the new historians of capitalism. It's a school of thought. And the gist of their claim is that American free market capitalism and the Industrial Revolution in the United States could not have existed unless it was built on the backs of plantation slavery. They say that slave-owning plantations are the impetus that starts industrialization in the United States and makes us wealthy today. And they jump immediately from that to a political case, saying, well, if capitalism is tainted by slavery, capitalism itself is immoral and needs to be overthrown, revised, redistributed. So they jump into policies. In like 2024, all of these characters are advocates of redistributionist wealth taxes and slavery reparations and socialized health care. And they say that this is owed to Americans because of the legacy of slavery, and their supposed proof is that our economy is intertwined with the fruits of this ill-gotten gain of slavery and capitalism together. Turns out that their evidence is extremely flimsy. They're even worse at doing history than Nicole Hannah-Jones. I noticed this right off the bat when I was working on the 1619 Project essay. In this column, what I have highlighted in blue, I know that's a little bit small, but I'll read it to you briefly. Matthew Desmond, in his opening essay, to make his case, his first example, he says, when accountants depreciate assets or use double entry accounting for their businesses, and spend an afternoon filling in rows and columns on an Excel spreadsheet, they are repeating a business practice whose roots twist back to the slave labor camps of the plantations. How many of you knew if you filled out Microsoft Excel spreadsheets, you were borrowing something from slavery? That's a pretty bold claim. And he cites it in the next sentence to a book by historian Caitlin Rosenthal. I'm reading that essay. I had Caitlin Rosenthal's book on my bookshelf. I pulled it out and opened it up to see if she made that claim. Turns out Matthew Desmond misread the whole thing. Her book is about accounting practices and slavery, but she says, this is not an origin story. I did not find a simple path where slaveholders paper spreadsheets basically developed from Microsoft Excel. So she said the exact opposite. Desmond misread it, inverted her claim, and built the 1619 Project's essay on capitalism off of that error. New York Times is a paper record. I see this. I decided to write the editor and say, you need to issue a correction. Here are the two sources side by side. You made a mistake. I get a response back from them. Said, well, we read over your argument. We read over Professor Desmond and talked to him. And we just see this as a difference of interpretation of the language. And they refuse to make the correction. And it continues from there. What's missing from this attempt to wed slavery to capitalism is any intellectual history of the notion of capitalism itself. We say that there's any figure in history who's most closely associated with the formulative ideas behind a free market capitalist economy, it is probably Adam Smith. Fair enough? I think almost everyone's in agreement on that. It's uncontested whether you're on the left, right, or anywhere else. Adam Smith is like the genesis point of capitalist economics. Turns out Adam Smith's an abolitionist. How could the founding intellectual figure of capitalism be an abolitionist if capitalism is wedded to slavery? The 1619 Project had no answer for that. It gets even worse, is if we go to the other side, the pro-slavery side, and ask, what did they think of economics? We find in the eve of the Civil War, there's this individual by the name of George Fitzhugh. He's the most prominent advocate of a pro-slavery argument against the abolitionists we all know. The William Lloyd Garrisons and Frederick Douglasses. Fitzhugh is seen as the opposite side, and he's probably the most prominent national figure of the pro-slavery side. Turns out, he despises market capitalism because he says it brings disorder to the orderly, structured, top-down, command and control, centrally planned economic model of the plantation. And he even denounced, he goes so far as to say that these market economists, the Adam Smiths of the world, we should cast their books into the fire because they are at war with slavery. They're going to destroy our institution with their notions of free labor and choice. They're going to basically undermine our entire institution. So it turns out not only are the capitalist intellectual figures most closely aligned with abolition, the pro-slavery figures are most closely aligned with anti-capitalism in the 19th century. Basically what I'm saying is the new historians of capitalism did not pay any attention to history of the figures that were writing in that era. What they did do is make some very atrocious mathematical and empirical and factual errors. Ed Baptist, one of the major figures of the New History of Capitalism School, wrote this book called The Half Has Never Been Told. Notice new, the half has never been told. He's trying to claim novelty to his approach. This came out in the early 2010s. And the gist is he asserts that 50% of the U.S. economy was tied to slavery before the Civil War. I'm an economic historian. I work on these numbers, data all the time. Turns out the reality is only 5 to 6%. It's a tiny fraction of a national economy. Magness goes even further and says that slavery is what made the American economy strong before the Civil War. Well, remember, he claims this is a new claim. The half has never been told. The new history of capitalism. It turns out it's actually an old claim. Although Nicole Hannah-Jones was asked to comment on this, including by me. In the early debates after the 1619 Project, she said, well, yeah, maybe some economists dispute a few of Baptist calculations, but not the book itself. This is a valid book. There's some of the economists, once you read them, they basically say that this is pseudo-scholarship, it's nonsense, it's junk, has no place as a basis for history. This is a discredited book, and the 1619 Project built its entire economic narrative around it. I pointed that out, Nicole Hannah-Jones, she didn't like it too much. But what's really going on with the new history of capitalism school is they've revived a not-so-new idea. They revived an idea that actually traces its origins to the 1850s. We refer to this in traditional history books as the King Cotton theory of economic development. I'm sure all of you have heard that term in some version or another. And the gist of it was an argument that was made on the eve of the Civil War. Senator James Henry Hammond of South Carolina popularized it, although there were several books and articles written on it. And the gist of the claim was that cotton was so essential to not only the American economy, but global economic production and prosperity, that if anyone disrupted the slave system, they would thrust the world into a depression. They would destroy themselves. It was an assertion by Southern slave owners that, well, you Northerners, your economy is dependent on us for raw materials, and if you make war upon that, you are making war upon yourselves. You're going to condemn yourselves to poverty. And you can see how this is very useful on the eve of the Civil War, because the Confederacy embraced this as an economic strategy. It said, we're going to go it alone, depending on cotton being the most important resource in the world, and because of that, all the foreign powers will come to our aid, will cut off the North from its raw materials, and they'll find economic ruination and collapse, and we will be the ascendant nation of the continent now. Did that work? Not so well. The Civil War itself is a testament to the failure of King Cotton theory. This cartoon came out right before the Civil War, and it's the planter, and it depicts Cotton is a monarch. The guy in the top head, that's John Bull. He's the British representation, British equivalent of like what Uncle Sam is in our political cartoons. And the pre-Civil War version, John Bull was begging for prosperity from cotton. This one came out during the war. There's John Bull turning his back on the South. He says, we're going to get our cotton from somewhere else. We can go to India. We can go to Egypt. We can purchase it from free laborers. So the promised recession never came. Cotton industry continues on its own trajectory without the South. King Cotton theory was debunked on the battlefields in 1865. And yet here we are, a century and a half later, we have academics reviving it as if it's a serious economic doctrine, not because they care about cotton and slavery, but because they want to discredit capitalism for political reasons. I'm going to jump ahead and end on this final point, because I do want to talk about one area where the 1619 Project did get it right initially. Although, keep in mind, the 1619 Project likes to revise itself very selectively. They won't answer requests for a correction on basic factual errors, but they will change their text. What did the 1619 Project get right? Well, it actually did make a justified call for examining the nuances of how we abolished slavery in the United States, and one that I actually agree with up to a point. We know the Emancipation Proclamation was passed in 1863. We all know the famous stories around that. We've probably seen the Lincoln movie by Steven Spielberg. These are all parts of the historical record and how we remember it. But we also know that there are complexities about slavery. At the time of its abolition, the big question in everyone's mind, what happens to the freed slaves after the proclamation is issued? Including Abraham Lincoln. Unfortunately, large parts of the country still had very deep racist traditions in them, including the American South. And Lincoln was horrified. He basically predicted the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and Jim Crow in the decades that followed, so that people would be free but then oppressed if left to live among their own former masters. And in ways that are probably somewhat retrograde from our own modern standards, though, at his own time he was trying to find a solution. And one of the solutions that Lincoln came up with is he proposed resettling freed slaves abroad in places like Liberia or South and Central America, and devoted substantial resources to the U.S. government in trying to foster this program. Now, fortunately, we did not take that path. It basically ended after the Civil War and with Lincoln's assassination, but nonetheless, it's part of the record and part of the motive and part of the politics of how emancipation came about. The 1619 Project, to its credit, to very slim credit, said we need to pay attention to this nuance and ask what it means for interpreting the complexity of the emancipation story. I read that part of it and said, well, finally, they got something right after all these different issues. And how did I know they got something right? Well, it turns out this is an area I had worked on for over a decade prior to the 1619 Project. And when Nicole Hannah-Jones got criticized over this particular passage, she tweeted out a link. Said, well, more recent history shows that in fact I am asking the right questions. And she tweeted a link to a newspaper called the New York Times that she works at. In an article from January 2013, you take a look at the author there. She also tweeted out a link to a book. It was a book that I had co-authored. It was about the colonization movement, the complexities of emancipation in the Civil War. Saying, wait, historical scholarship does support me on this. Then someone pointed out, said, you realize this is the guy that just asked for a correction to your other parts of the essay and wrote a critique of your economic analysis in the 1619 Project. And yet the documentation was there. These are records that I found myself showing that Lincoln was involved in this colonization project. There's one I discovered in the National Archives of Belize from 1863, previously unknown. We actually have records that went down there and found the site of one of the proposed colonies that they were building. It's in the jungle in Belize. They had similar projects launched in Jamaica and Haiti and Guyana, and then Liberia is the best known. So it's stuff that really existed. The history is unimpeachable that this actually happened. But someone pointed out to Nicole Hannah-Jones that I was the person that had worked on it. And then she starts tweeting. You can read some of those, and they get smaller. It's just a barrage of insults and name-calling and denunciations. And what comes out of this is probably the most substantive revision to the 1619 Project that was made between the book and the earlier newspaper version. She excised the whole narrative about Lincoln and colonization, basically cuts it out because she can no longer cite me because I'm a critic, and replaced it with Ibram X. Kendi, who had a very erroneous conventional narrative that downplayed this component of the American Civil War. So this may be one of the areas where I think the 1619 Project jumped from an erroneous journalism project into just pure partisan political retribution and self-editing. It gets even worse because shortly after that, Nicole Hannah-Jones started taking flack in the political scene for her original claim that 1619 was the true American founding and should replace and displace 1776 and give us a slavery-centric origin story. She went on CNN in the fall of 2020 and was asked about this. This is in the aftermath of the Black Lives Matter protests, in the aftermath of all of the events, George Floyd and everything from the summer of 2020. This is very high on the political conscience of the world. And she's asked about this claim. Should we discard 1776 and replace it with 1619? And she goes on CNN and says, I never said that. I was watching it, as were dozens of journalists, even friendly journalists, start commenting and saying, wait, I just saw Nicole Hannah-Jones say she never made the most controversial claim for the 1619 Project. I was curious myself because I remembered distinctly reading it. There it is right there. That was the original August 2019 version of the newspaper's website. It says, understanding 1619 is our true founding, not 1776. That paragraph is right there. And I went and found an archived version of it, but then I went to the, back to the New York Times' website. It turns out they do make edits after all. They just don't tell you about them. They crossed it out. They deleted it. They made it go away. They sent it down the memory hole. And this is the status where the 1619 project exists today. A couple days later, after I wrote about this and publicized it, Nicole Hannah-Jones is asked, there were no stealth corrections to the newspaper. Do you believe your eyes or do you believe your tweets? Caused a minor fracas in the New York Times' newsroom, including another columnist at the Times, basically called her out for journalistic malpractice. She responded by trying to get him fired. And that's the current status, unfortunately, of where the 1619 project has gone. I'll end on that note just by summarizing and making the point that I think the 1619 project started by asking interesting questions about U.S. history and the relation to slavery. It went in with a political angle, but it still had an option, it still had a choice early on in that discussion. And that could have been, do we advance the dialogue of having a civil, factually grounded discourse and investigation into the history of slavery, including all of its complexities, a warts-and-all version of history that nonetheless remains grounded in truth? Or do we try to use history as a bludgeon from the past to get political objectives in the present? Unfortunately, they chose that latter route. Unfortunately, they ended up with a project that is even more politicized than it began with. And that's what they're trying to put into our schools today. So I'll end on that point, and I will bring up my colleague, Mark Schug, to talk to you for the next component of the lecture. So thank you.
Thank you, and I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Mark Schug. I first met Mark when I was in my early 30s or so, and I came to Brookfield Academy as an economics teacher. And he's been instrumental in advancing economic education, not only in Wisconsin, but also throughout the country. He cares deeply about economic and financial literacy, market-based education reforms, and I think above all, excellent teaching. He's now president of Mark Schug Consulting Service. Today, he'll be drawing from a very deep well of experience to tell us about the state of economic education in our country.
Thank you, Bruce. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. See a few familiar faces, some former students of mine that teach here at Brookfield Academy, and I'm very, very proud of that. I would like to talk to you about human flourishing, alternative approaches, and curriculum for social studies. So the way I'm going to do this is there's a lot of, if there's anything about the 1619 project, I find the whole thing depressing. With its deception and with its overall message that we should hate ourselves. And so that's very discouraging. So I'm going to talk about a couple of things. I'm going to talk about economic freedom, and I have a story regarding African Americans' economic freedom and human capital investments that are just true of many uplifting sorts of stories that I think need to be part of the record as well. And then I'm going to talk about some resources that I consider to be considerably more balanced than the 1619 project. So let's take a look at economic freedom for just a moment. Now, Deirdre McCloskey, many of you probably have heard of Deirdre, really a very solid economist and economic historian. She writes here about the Great Enrichment, and she provides us this graph. Now, this is 1750 to around 2018, and what you're looking at is per capita GDP, real per capita GDP during that period. And she's commenting on this amazing takeoff, which happens around 1850, but then look what happens after World War II, where economic expansion just explodes, where our standard of living, since my parents were around, has has increased many times over. You think about what we have today versus what we had in 1950, right? It's astonishing. And so she comments on this great enrichment. And Milton Friedman explains to Phil Donahue in 1979 in a very famous interview. He says, now this is Friedman, says, the only cases in which the masses have escaped grinding poverty was when they have capitalism and largely free trade. If you want to know where the masses are worst off, it's in exactly the kinds of societies that depart from that. Friedman probably had in mind places like North Korea, East Germany, countries in Latin America, many countries in Africa, south of the Sahara. He puts it in a very simple phrase, but let's elaborate this a little bit. What we're really talking about is economic freedom, which is really some of the fundamentals of capitalism. And my good friend Jim Courtney, who recently passed away, Bob Lawson, these are great scholars. They define economic freedom this way. They say economic freedom is based on the concept of self-ownership. Because of self-ownership, individuals have the right to choose to decide how to use their time and talents to shape their lives. On the other hand, I don't have the right to your talents. I don't have the right to your resources. The only way I can obtain income from you is to offer you something that you voluntarily would like to purchase. So I'm here as a speaker, right? Somebody's paying for me to be here. And that's part of, and I agreed to come from Florida, rolling the dice, coming to in February in Wisconsin after living here for many, many years. So I don't have the right to your time, talents, and resources. If I want that, I have to earn it by giving you something that you value and that you're willing to provide to me voluntarily. So the cornerstone of economic freedom is personal choice, voluntary exchange, open markets, and clearly defined property rights. And please just notice everything we were talking about in slavery. Was slavery a capitalistic institution? It couldn't possibly be, because it denies voluntary exchange and personal choice. The only way slavery operates is through coercion. All times, everywhere. It depends on coercion. And so it's not the embodiment of capitalism, it's the complete opposite of capitalism. So just to continue the story, economic freedom has been the subject of a large research project called the Fraser, this is the Fraser Institute up in Vancouver, called the Economic Freedom of the World Index. Now this ranks 161 countries. That's not all the countries in the world. From 42 data points, and they use that to construct the summary index. The data is always, there's a lag, because they're not creating their data on the basis of some survey. They're doing it on the numbers given to them by public sources such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And they've been used in 400 scholarly articles and been cited over 1,200 times. So what items do they use? What are their metrics? How are they approaching this? Well, so they're looking for countries, they're finding some measures of political stability, and then secure property rights, limited government involvement in the economy. Yes, government has a critical role to play in the economy, but it's limited. Most of economic activity is in the private sector. Reasonable regulation for sure, we need that. But people should be able to start a company relatively easily, to start a new business relatively easily. And so that's still what we want to have. That's what we mean by reasonable regulation. Sound money, good central bank system that controls inflation. Legal systems based on rule of law. So this is basically a good court system that fairly and judiciously enforces especially contract law. And freedom to trade. By and large, freedom to trade. So we take those 7 things and then look to see where are the countries in the world, how do they stack up. Well, I got the top 15 and the bottom 15. At the very top is home. I don't have an arrow next to it because it's rapidly declining. Remember, the data lags a little bit. So maybe the next best interesting thing there in Singapore is the second extreme. You know that place, Singapore? All those natural resources, all those oil, yeah, no natural resources, just a rock in the ocean. And they're extremely economically free, and they're extremely economically prosperous. There's Switzerland, might surprise some people. That's Denmark. These are sometimes regarded as somewhat socialist countries. No, they're very high in economic freedom. The United States ranks number 7. There's Japan. And then at the very bottom, I was recently, this last September, I was in Zimbabwe. We were in South Africa, and then we went up to Zimbabwe for a short time. It doesn't have any of those 7 points. I mean, it's just a masterpiece. And so, yes, so when you're walking through a small town in Zimbabwe, it's like it's 1860. You know, it's just this really, real poverty. And then there's Venezuela. Well, who's missing? Who would you expect to be very low? Not China. No, China's considerably higher. What? Not Russia. What's the largest economic basket case in the world? That'd be North Korea. And Cuba would be right there too. North Korea is a disaster. And why aren't they here? Because nobody believes anything they say. And so there is no data that anybody trusts. And Cuba is collapsing so fast, it's hard to overstate how much trouble they're in. And of course, it's because of the United States. But anyway, that's a joke. That's a joke. Okay, all right. And so this is important stuff, and it gets more important. So here we're talking about extreme poverty. That's people living on $1.90 a day. That's the extreme poverty. It's over. I've got another chart, but I don't have time for it, that shows how extreme poverty has been declining dramatically over the last since World War II. But look at that. It's the least free nations of the world. Nearly 30%. Nearly 30% are the least free. And over here, in the most free nations, it doesn't exist. Okay, now let's just take per capita income. And how does that look? And we spread that out. And here's the least free nations. You have a tiny share of per capita GDP, and here are the most free nations. So clearly, countries like the United States, Canada, Australia, United Kingdom have achieved, Japan, have achieved remarkable levels of growth because they have those 7 things lined up pretty well. Just life expectancy. People live longer. I'm living longer than my parents. Because when my mother had a heart attack and had a stroke, she had high blood pressure. There was no medication. 0. You know, don't eat so much salt. Right? And that was, and today, so in countries such as Canada and the United States, life expectancy is much higher, and political and civil rights as well. I got a dozen more slides on this. But in terms of teaching, they have this great map. And the blue countries are the economically free nations. You can see them spread around the world. The red are the least economically free. Back in 1975, China would be completely red. But then after Deng Xiaoping, it becomes orange because they embraced many market features that now Xi Jinping is rapidly abandoning. So I'll come back to that in a minute. So maybe now, this would be a good time to share some of this very rich empirical information that's in the Economic Freedom Index with young people. I'm going to tell you one other story real quick. It's not the presence of markets, of capitalism, that held African Americans back. It was the lack of economic freedom and capitalism, the denial of economic freedom and capitalism. That's what kept them back. And the key to a well-functioning market is voluntary exchange, the ability of people to negotiate contracts and compete in labor markets and voluntarily trade with each other. Precisely what was denied African Americans during slavery and after slavery. It's hard to overstate how state-sponsored racist policies held African Americans back. Let's explore this a little bit. We know about Jim Crow laws, prevented many African Americans in the South from getting good-paying jobs, as well as discrimination in the North. Normally, in a well-functioning labor market, people are hired based on their skills. Jim Crow laws and other discrimination prevented that, and therefore African Americans could not get into management jobs, sales jobs, highly skilled trades. The labor unions in the North carefully, deliberately denied African Americans to get into the trades. It was a deliberate policy. That's the same reason that the minimum wage was passed. The unions favored it so that African Americans would be priced out of the market because they'd be willing to work for less. That's precisely the history of the minimum wage. So, one of slavery's most pernicious legacies is that it was illegal to teach African American children how to read, or adults for that matter. I'm drawing a lot on a guy named Robert Margo in a piece he wrote in 1993. And he says between 90 and 95% of African Americans upon being freed were illiterate. That's a tough place to start. The first generation of newly freed African Americans did not get, it's supposed to be 40 acres in a mule. Instead, they got busy working long hours. Racial discrimination, as we referred to a couple times, is very hard to defeat. People thought that the races could be separate, that was desirable. By the 1890s, the belief in racial segregation became part of the Jim Crow laws. In many states, had established separate schools for whites and for African American kids. By the 1890s, most African Americans are still living in the South, and the schools for African American children were separate for sure, but they were hardly equal. So, incomes begin to rise among African American families. This is happening way before the Civil Rights Movement. How does that happen? Well, first, they get to work for themselves and keep their income. So people start working pretty hard. Sharecropping is kind of a mess, but it was better than the alternative. Later, investments in education begin to pay off. By 1939, average incomes of African American family was a little more than a third of what it was for white families. By 1949, it's just under half. And by 1955, when Rosa Parks fails to give up her seat and beginning the Montgomery bus boycott, it's a little over half. Now that's still not good, but that's definitely progress. So, how did that happen? So, economists have a term, many of you have heard it, it's called investing in human capital. Human capital means investments in formal education. We're sitting in the middle of a human capital factory here. It also means any kind of way of learning, learning from each other, on-the-job training, any kind of learning you do. We tend to depend on schooling to really kind of measure that. And so this is a real, I want every young person to see this. And you see at the top, here's a doctorate degree, professional degree, master's degree, and you see their level of median income, these are weekly earnings, are very high. And this is a kid that didn't graduate from high school. So the pattern is very clear. If you have a higher amount of formal education, by and large, you've got better skills to sell, and you will make a better income. We can play around, there's some exceptions and whatnot to this, but generally speaking, that's the case. And then unemployment is just inverse of that. Those people up in the very high amounts of education have essentially no unemployment. And people down here that don't have very good skills to offer in the marketplace have very high unemployment rates. All right, so this is kind of the human capital story, all right? So, generations of African American parents began to send, first thing they did was to send their kids to school because they've been denied this for generations. So they send their kids to school. By 1900, 37% of Southern African Americans between ages 15 and 24 were completely illiterate. By 1920, it had dropped to 18%. By 1950, 69% of African American kids were going to school, the same amount as white kids, and African American girls had higher school attendance rates than white boys. And so Margot observes that each successive generation of African American children attended school more than the previous generation. Why is that important? But probably when we started this, you think, well, African American incomes got better because of the Great Migration. And of course, you'd be right about that. But who migrated? Who was most likely to leave the South? The people that had a better education. And they were likely to get writing letters back and forth from family members, reading newspapers, and then once they got there, they had the better skills to succeed. Okay? So the human capital story is rarely told in the context of the migration story. Migration story is very important. You know, during World War I, World War II, a lot of blacks moved out of the South to the West and the Midwest and so forth. But who went? And it was largely people that had more schooling. So African Americans with higher levels of education were more likely to migrate, and they're also more prepared to do well in those jobs. So the fact that racial differences in education and income would reduce over time is largely due to ordinary African American parents. Margot writes, thus black parents are the unsung heroes of the civil rights movement. And you've never heard that story before. And isn't that an uplifting story of agency and perseverance under very difficult circumstances? So there's a lot more stories like this that I think we should be sharing with our young people. Here are some resources maybe to consider. One that I'm sure that the teachers here used to know about very well is this book called Land of Hope, An Invitation to the Great American Story by Bill McClay. It's just an excellent book. It returns to a tradition of historical writing which involves telling stories. It also gets the civics content right, and he's very careful about planting seeds of patriotism in a very reasoned way, and he gets the economics right. That's a pretty big load. And Bill's a very smart guy. The book has sold very well. Another great book that's more just on the economic side is Jim Courtney and his wonderful colleagues, Common Sense Economics. This is coming out in the 3rd edition now. And it has 4 really interesting parts. Key elements of economics. This is a summary of the economic way of thinking. Institutions for prosperity. That's a lot of the economic freedom stuff that we've just been talking about. And economics of political decision making. And then many of those concepts, especially in part 1 and part 2, are applied to personal finance. And there's really a nice, very accessible personal finance story in there. And then there's an accompanying website called Common Sense Economics that for teachers is loaded with different resources. So, real quickly, some curriculum materials. Not more than a couple minutes here. First, the Fraser Institute has some nice lesson plans on economic freedom specifically. And they build some lessons around this map I showed you earlier. Here's the economic freedom of the United States. There's also an economic freedom of North America. And so there's some nice lesson plans that are up at the Fraser Institute. And there they are, lessons in economic freedom. Then the Bill of Rights Institute has a very nice civics curriculum called Being American. When I'm doing some writing, I look at this. Okay, I've referred to it many times. It's a very, very well-crafted curriculum. We love the people in the Federal Reserve, the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank. They have all kinds of materials that are civics and history and mainly economics. But there's some really great stuff here, very well written. The Fed won't publish anything that hasn't been carefully reviewed. And sometimes the material kind of comes out a little bland because of it, but it's okay. Then they have the FRED, the Federal Reserve Economic Data. This is a GDP chart from 1950 to today. There's the Great Recession. There's the, that's COVID. Students would have a field day in here. teachers and students, because it's you can do all kinds of data hounds everywhere, and all kinds of great research projects that kids can be involved in, and it's all real solid data. So Scott and I and other economists we know, they use this stuff all the time. And there's a thing called ISIT. They have stuff for all areas of social studies. This is a nice set of videos, and I'm going to end with this. So Scott Anderson here, who hasn't really been introduced carefully, Economic Episodes of American History. Scott and I are the co-author with a couple other colleagues. That book uses the economic way of thinking as a device, as a tool to try and improve kids' understanding of history. We're not trying to colonize American history for economics, quite the opposite. We're trying to use the tools of economics to sharpen up kids' understanding of history itself. And then as a companion piece, Economic Episodes for Civics and American Government is based on the same thing, and that's more built for a civics course. So a little self-serving there, but we've had a lot of fun producing these books, and we do a lot of workshops around the country with them. So, once over lightly, Economic Freedom of the World Index presents a great deal of evidence regarding social benefits associated with free enterprise, free markets, capitalism. It wasn't capitalism that placed burdens on African Americans, it was the lack of it, and then their struggle to overcome things in those odds, against those tall odds. And then there's a lot of great balanced material out there that I'm sure the Brookfield history teachers know all about, but now maybe you know a little bit more about it too. That's my story. Have a great afternoon, folks. Do we have time for questions?
Some people need to get back.
I'm sure.